Hello, and welcome to our series, Using Your Math Curriculum Virtually. I'm Melinda Griffin, a researcher at American Institutes for Research and a member of the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project. I'll be your host during this series. We have created a series of mini modules to help you think through how to teach math virtually. In previous models, we learned how to teach math virtually and determining what to teach your students, knowing that you have limited time together. In this third module, we will discuss planning lessons for distance learning. Note that I'll use the terms virtual learning and distance learning throughout this session. There's a distinction between these. Online learning is planned to be delivered virtually from the very start, whereas we're adapting what we would normally be using for in-person instruction to a virtual environment where teachers and students interact from a distance. Throughout this series, we're adhering to some guiding principles. The first, try to use what you've already been using. Keep it clear and simple. We're going to combine new learning with keeping skills sharp, and we want to make sure our plan works for all families, both those that have online access and those that don't. This is a really big undertaking and a major shift in how we teach and how our students learn. So you need support just as your students do. This should not be a solo effort. Make sure you give yourself time to meet with your fellow educators to plan, share resources, reflect with each other, and adjust to ongoing demands. So let's get started. In this session, Planning the Virtual Lesson, we'll talk about anticipating student needs, identifying components for distance learning lessons, and student supports. In the previous module, we looked at how you will need to reconfigure your pacing in the long-term sense. In other words, adjusting the time needed to teach a standard from the physical classroom to virtual learning, realizing that you have less time together online and supporting your students is going to look different. So we need to make sure that we space the pacing out. So before we go any further, and before you start doing any actual lesson planning, I want you to think about each student in your class. In math, we would call this reading and understanding the problem before attempting to solve it. You've been together as a classroom family for many months now, so you know your students well. Think about the learning strengths and weaknesses each student has overall, and then just in mathematics. Will you need to provide more scaffolding for this student? Perhaps a longer or more thorough review of the material prior to moving on to something new. What about needing extra independent work with math fluency? Also consider any modifications or accommodations each student needs. You've been using these throughout the year to the point that in your regular classroom, you probably didn't have to think too much about this. But now we need to map those accommodations or modifications to virtual support. For each student, write down anything you feel might need to be considered when working in an online environment. This brings in what you know about a student beyond academics. Will this student have adult support for learning at home? Is there a language barrier? Do you know if this student has connectivity to access and use online learning? You should also consider supports that a student will need to work independently. Teachers often use verbal and visual clues in the classroom, but these will not be there when a student is working at home by themselves. I'd also like to talk about access and equity for a moment. In the current crisis, we hear a lot about access in terms of the ability to connect online or have use of a computer. Access can also be limited by illness or time constraints in the home. But we also want to consider access and equity with regards to mathematics. As you see in this quote from NCTM's Principles to Action book, we want to think in terms of students being able to learn and interact with mathematics. To help you think through access and equity issues, our lesson planning template provides space to consider these supports, both virtual and otherwise, that your students will need. You'll find this template available in the resources in our Google Drive. So let's start out by thinking about some instructional considerations. So what are the lead-in skills that students need for the lesson you're going to teach? These could be skills that you can access via a warm-up activity, or you might decide to include a short refresher as part of your direct teaching lesson. You also want to think about streamlining direct instruction for new concepts and skills. Online learning will be much more direct than what you use in the classroom. You'll need to look at your original plans and carefully select the examples that you want to work through with students, making sure that you focus on models or strategies that are called out in the standard you are teaching. Also realize that you might need to cover a strategy over 2 days or even 3 rather than the single day that you would have used in the classroom. Also think about how you can continue using models and strategies that your students already know. The more you can stay with the familiar, the easier this will be for both you and your students. For example, if you've previously worked with bar diagrams or schemas as a way to approach problem solving, be sure to continue modeling their use with your students. This includes any problem-solving acronyms that you might use regularly, such as UPS check. We're going to rethink the time that you spend with your students. That time is going to be short, so you need to think through the specific example problems that students practice with you versus the ones that they complete independently. We'll talk more about this in the next module about independent work, which is an area where you can do more differentiation. As we discussed in the previous model, we're going to continue approaching our planning using Universal Design for Learning so that we consider student access and supports up front. While you're planning, you want to keep in mind student supports. Our planning template includes an area to list the accommodations and modifications that you need for the lesson, as well as any specialized online apps that would be helpful to students. Let's look closer at 3 areas where students might need supports and scaffolds: materials, lesson delivery, and independent work. For materials, this could include anything from considering the physical items a student needs to work math tasks to possibly virtual manipulatives or other apps online that they could use. This might also include providing a short video or audio recording of the directions for a task. For lesson delivery, we want to keep in mind that the majority of students are visual learners, so you want to make sure you have clear visuals with your audio instruction. You also need to consider the mode of delivery, such as adding closed captioning to a recorded lesson, which benefits hearing impaired students as well as language learners. You might need to provide additional videos, reading excerpts, or guided examples for your students. And additional time spent working with students through one-on-one check-ins or small group meetings might also be beneficial. In independent work, we're going to look into this in more detail in our next module, but as you're going through your publisher's lesson materials, begin to consider the independent work you want your students to complete. It's important to consider executive functioning supports, such as checklists, graphic organizers, timers, and other reminders. You might need to modify or differentiate assignments, and it's also helpful to vary the required response mode to provide multiple options for students. So now let's take a look at adjusting the daily lesson itself. Here are the typical components of a daily lesson that you would find if you were using a published curriculum. You'd start the day with a warm-up. You might budget some time to go over homework with students, and then you get to the lesson. This is where you introduce new material, thinking aloud and modeling it for students. You'll have guided practice for your students as well. Sometimes this threads throughout the lesson, and sometimes it's a segment that comes afterwards. Then your students move on to independent practice, but you're in the room with them to help guide them through this. And you wind up your lesson with closure and next steps, and possibly assign homework to your students, depending on how the day has gone. Throughout all this, your curriculum probably provides guidance as well on additional supports that your students might need. With distance learning, we're going to have less time with our students, so you're going to have to maximize the interaction time that you have with them, realizing that not all of your students will be able to join you for live online discussions. So here are our components for a distance learning lesson. We'll have a warm-up or review. We might do this independently before you get to the actual lesson itself, or you might choose to do this with a group during one of your meetings. Then we have the lesson. The lesson introduces new material that students need to learn. This will be done doing student-directed learning time, or what we are going to call independent practice. You'll also have virtual meetings with your student. These might be with a whole class, just a small group, or an individual. In the physical classroom, you provided guided practice meshed in with the lesson itself, or you worked problems with the class right after you taught the lesson. With distance learning, you want your students to continue to benefit from working through problems with you, so virtual meetings are our best option for doing guided problems with our students. Now let's break the virtual lesson down into smaller components. We're going to think of this in 2 sections: asynchronous, which students complete apart from you, and synchronous, where you interact with students in real time. Asynchronous components occur independent of the group. This includes the warm-up and any review that you need students to complete, the lesson itself, and independent practice and work. Students will be self-directing during this time, so this is where supports can be very helpful. During the synchronous portion, you may choose to meet with the whole class with small groups, or individually with students. Know that there is no specified platform for these components. Depending on your students' needs, activities in these components could require the use of technology or not, or perhaps a combination of the two. Now let's dive a little deeper into each of these subgroups. So let's start by thinking about the warm-up or review. In the physical classroom, this is used to engage students as they come into the classroom or might serve as a transition for other subjects. This gives the teacher time to organize the class before starting into new material, and this is where we often see housekeeping type chores, such as taking attendance or checking to see if students have completed their homework. The warm-up itself could be a review of prior material learned, or it might be something completely different, and the teacher tailors it to what her students need that day. With distance learning, our warm-up or review could be used to practice skills that students need for the day's lesson. We might decide for it to be a fluency activity to help students keep their skills sharp. Perhaps it's a problem for students to solve, or it might just be something to show kids how cool math is in the world. So the warm-up buys you time in a physical classroom, but in a virtual environment, you want to streamline the process. You could have the students do the warm-up ahead of time. In fact, possibly post all the warm-ups for the week, so that students are prepared for class discussion when you meet with them, or you might want to have students do the warm-ups ahead of time and submit their work to you. Submitting their work ahead of time allows you to see the work and make adjustments to your instruction, particularly when you meet with students in those small groups. You might also choose, over the course of a week, 2 to 3 students' responses to highlight when you do meet with them together. If you've worked with our project before, you know that we suggest number talks as a great way to engage all learners in mathematics. You can do number talks virtually too. We've created a separate mini module so that you can learn more about it. We'll also talk about all of these other suggestions in the next module in this series, where we focus on independent learning. Now let's think about the lesson. In the physical classroom, the teacher introduces the new concept or skill, including applicable vocabulary that students need to know. The teacher models the skill for students, often with a think aloud, and guided practice may be interspersed or follow the lesson. With distance learning, our time is much more condensed. You need to be sure to identify the learning outcome for the lesson in student-friendly terms. This is not the time to read the standard aloud, which will just confuse students and their parents. A pre-recorded video should be no longer than about 5 minutes. You might choose a combination of a short video from your curriculum series, along with a video of you doing guided practice problems. Remember that most people are visual learners, so consider how you will display your work in a video. For students without online access, you'll need to provide a paper-based lesson, which will include teaching the material and some guided practice problems or worked examples. Then there are logistics. How will you record the lesson? How will you post the lesson? And how will you inform students and parents that it's there and ready for them to learn? Check with your school to see if a system is in place for reaching out to parents or students, as well as the online platforms they prefer you to use. Most schools and districts are using a single platform, which keeps parents and students from having to switch back and forth. For recording the lesson, there are numerous apps available. This is where you need to find a tech buddy to work with. Ideally, your entire team is using the same app, which will allow for in-house troubleshooting and sharing of ideas. The module after this will focus on student-directed learning, and we'll go into more detail on what these lessons look like and how to create them. Then we have independent practice. In the physical classroom, the teacher assigns the work and students complete it individually with a partner or perhaps in small groups. While they're doing this, the teacher circulates throughout the room to observe students' work, answer questions that students have, or perhaps ask clarifying questions or offer guidance based on what you see. The teacher may stop the class to offer guidance if she sees common errors or struggles occurring. And time permitting, the teacher may review the answers with the class. With distance learning, independent practice occurs asynchronously, with students completing the work on their own time. Instructions need to be clear and simple, including not only how to complete the math portion, but how to access and use any technology required. This will also include student logins and passwords. Don't assume that just because they remembered it every day in your classroom, that they're going to remember it now. You should also realize that students are going to need more time to complete the work independently than they would if they were with you. There may or may not be much in-person help available to the student, so you need to make sure you provide supports to help them complete the work by themselves. We also need to think about which problems are critical for all students to solve, how we might differentiate the work, and what supports students need. As with the regular lesson, check to see what resources are available in your curriculum. Some publishers include adaptive assignments that adjust as students complete the work, and you can also see the analytics to find out how students are doing. For students who cannot do the work online, think about any additional materials you need to include with the paper pencil version. This might include manipulatives, graph paper, or other items that can help them be successful. Also keep in mind that most families do not have access to a printer at home. So if they need paper and pencil materials, you'll need to provide these from the school. You should incorporate models and strategies that students are already familiar with whenever possible. And it is still possible to do some partner and small group work. We'll talk about this more in the next module, which focuses on student-directed learning. Now let's think about the synchronous portion of virtual learning, meeting with students. The hardest part of this move to distance learning is how much we miss one another. So meeting with students is important to maintain the relationships you've built during the school year, and it also provides comfort to everyone in these stressful times. So there's 3 different types of meetings to consider. For a whole class meeting, this will have some math focus, but it's also a chance to look beyond the lesson itself. You might do an interactive warm-up together as a group, or just have a class discussion about something students viewed or learned online. This is a great place to think about math in the real world, or maybe even read a math story together. It does not need to be elaborate, it's the connection that matters. For small groups, this will allow you to interact with fewer students, which gives students more voice. You can continue with the groups you had already set up in your classroom, or establish new ones based on need. You may also form a small group that meets at a time convenient for some students, possibly in the evening. This is where you can really differentiate and provide guidance on doing the math. A great way to help struggling students is through the use of interwoven problems, also known as interleaved-worked solutions strategy problems. You model a problem for students or do a guided problem with the group, and then the students do a problem independently. You repeat the process as many times as needed. Individual meetings give you a chance to talk directly with a student. This can be an offline meeting, perhaps by a phone call or FaceTime for students without internet access, or it might occur online through an app. You'll be able to address a student's needs privately and specifically, also gaining insight into the home environment to consider any other supports that are needed. Student meetings should last 15 to 20 minutes at most, perhaps even less if this is an individual call or a whole class meeting where you're just getting together to say hello. Try to schedule the whole class meetings as frequently as possible, even just a daily 5-minute check-in to get students going for the day. Small groups should meet at least twice a week. For individual calls, connect with students who need one-on-one help as often as they need to keep the work moving forward. You might also coordinate individual calls with your special education teacher. Throughout all of this, you're going to want to solicit student and parent feedback about how the process is going. Just like when you start anything new, there's going to be a learning curve for everyone involved. For students, you can ask for feedback when you meet with them through hand signals such as thumbs up or thumb down, or you might use online polls, a Google form, or a journal reflection. Parents are perhaps facing the steepest learning curve of all. Have them respond to a Google form weekly to give you insight as to how they're handling the logistics of distance learning, as well as providing insight into their child's experience. You may also find yourself inundated with parent emails, which may range from voicing frustration to asking for advice. Realize that you do not need to be available 24/7, but do plan some time each day to deal with parent correspondence. The clearer communication that you do up front, the less you'll have to address later. So keep parents informed with weekly plans and resources that they can use to help their child learn at home. So let's summarize what we've learned today. Before you start working on lesson plans, be sure to anticipate student needs. Think through the components of the distance learning lessons, and you'll find that a planning document can help you support student supports up front. Work with your coworkers to tackle this together. This is not something you should be doing all alone. So on behalf of the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project team, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And I hope you'll find the other videos in this series useful as well. Please be sure to check out our website where you'll find even more resources that you can use for teaching your students. We'll see you again soon, and have a great day.